We're going to look at importing resources into CDK. Now it's worth noting that importing resources is quite tricky and there are a few caveats and a few steps to go through. So it's probably worth thinking about, do you need to import the resource? And typically I think we look at importing resources because not importing them would cause some kind of disruption. So for example, if we have an RDS instance or a DynamoDB table, if we don't import these and we try and put them into CDK, we recreate them in CDK, we've got to have some kind of data migration to move them over. And that might end up with either a considerable amount of engineering work, or you might have some kind of downtime period which may or may not be acceptable in your context. So that aside, let's look at what we're going to import. So I'm in API Gateway here and I've got a custom domain name set up pointing to an API, and this is just the pet store API that you can make through a wizard in the console. So if I go to this URL, whoops, sorry, that's the Route 53 page. Then we go, here is the pet store URI API, and then I can go to /pets, and there's some pets. Let me zoom in there just so you can see the JSON. So we've got a domain name, we've got an API, and we might want to import this API, the custom domain name into CDK. Perhaps we've got multiple APIs connected to it, or maybe we have got this API domain name here hard-coded into some software or present in some software where we can't easily get people to update, but we want to move it into CDK's management. So for the moment, we'll just assume that we've had a bit of a think about the trade-off and the difficulty in doing this, and we've decided that we need to import this resource. So how do we do that? First, we have a little bit of homework to do. So we need to understand which CloudFormation resources would be used to represent the infrastructure that we've got. And not all CloudFormation resources support being imported. So I can have a look in this list, I can go to API Gateway, and I can see that we have the API Gateway domain name. Excellent. So that's a really good start. It being in that list means that we can import it. Now we've got to think about the other resources that are required to build this, because it's not just the API Gateway domain name, and we might want to import everything. If you imagine, we might be using infrastructure as code so that if something goes wrong, we can recreate it from scratch, or maybe we're trying to create a test environment that mimics the real thing. And as a result, we're trying to import things and we want the whole deal. We don't want to import some things and reference other bits. We just want to get the whole thing into CDK. So we need to go through these properties and also use our own knowledge of the service to understand what else is involved. So if we have a look at the API Gateway custom domain name in the console, you can see that it's linked to an API. So we are going to have to think about that mapping and how we would manage that. And if we go to the configuration, you can see that it's linked to a hosted zone. And we've also got a certificate. So here's our hosted zone with a DNS record in. That's actually different to the one listed there because that's to do with the alias that can be set up for this. But we do have a DNS record in a hosted zone that's pointing to our custom domain name. Whoops, let me pop that over so we can see that table together. There we go. Here's our A record, which is an alias. And we might want to import that at the same time, or we might want to do it later. It depends on what's acceptable to us. So that would mean that we need to make sure that there's an equivalent resource or an appropriate resource for the Route 53 record. So we can have a bit of a scroll down. We can find Route 53 on this page. And then we can see that we don't have the record set resource here. We've got the zone, so we can import a whole zone, but we can't import the record set. Or at least that's what the documentation implies at the moment. So we then reach a bit of a crossroads where we say, okay, we can only import part of the infrastructure that we're using here, and we would have to recreate the other infrastructure, or we would have to deal with the fact that it needs to be swapped over at some point in the future. So it's just something to bear in mind, something to think about. Additionally, we have an ACM certificate. So let's go and have a look for ACM in this documentation. And you can see that we can import things for ACM's private certificate authority, but ACM isn't listed here as something we could import, just in a public certificate. So I can go down these, I can check all the options, but the certificate itself isn't listed. So that means then we would have to deal with the fact that for our custom domain name, we have a DNS record that points to the custom domain name that we can't import into CDK, and we've got an ACM certificate that the custom domain name references that we can't import into CDK. So one thing you can have a play around with before you commit to the process at all is to try and recreate the resource in CDK. So let's get a new stack on the go. Oops, didn't mean to close that. And let's call this API stack. And we're just going to assume it's going to have empty properties. I'll take the Q stack off we had from our previous lesson because we don't need that anymore. And I will make API stack here. And it's the same song and dance. We're making a class and exporting it. It's going to be called API stack. I'll tell you what, let's have capitals today. It's going to extend stack. And it will have a constructor with 3 parameters. We have the scope, which is a construct, the ID, which is a string, and the props. And we're just going to go with the default properties object there. And then we pass in those 3 arguments to the parent constructor. So then we would want to make a domain name. So let's make the API gateway domain name, and then we're going to have that as being attached to the current stack. We'll give it an ID. What should we call it? CDK Course maybe. And then we're going to need some properties. So what properties do we have to provide? So we need domain name and certificate. So we've got domain name, which is a string. So let's pop in our CDK Course. In reality, you'd probably put that in as a property so it can be changed between environments, but we'll leave it hard-coded for now. And then we are expected to provide a certificate, which is an I certificate. So let's have a bit of a Google for AWS CDK ACM certificate. And let's go and have a look at the options we have for getting a certificate. So we're not trying to make a new one in CDK because we can't import it. So what we've got to do instead is we've got to reference an existing certificate. So we need to find a static method on the certificate class that lets us do this. So let's find certificate. Let's look for the static methods. And you can see here we have one static method called fromCertificateARN that takes a scope, an ID, and a certificate ARN. So I'm going to go and grab that certificate ARN from the console. And again, this is probably something you would put as a parameter, but we're just going to skip that for now. And let's make the certificate just above this domain name. So we use the class. Whoops, sorry, that's the wrong import. Dot. And then for some reason my IntelliSense is playing up these days, but we want the fromCertificateARN method, and then we're going to attach it to the current scope. We're going to give it a name, and then we're going to put in the ARN. Just as a bit of a demo of the technique, we're going to replace this region and account ID by using the AWS class, and we can pop in the region, and we can do the account ID like so, and then that chooses the right values. And obviously we've got the ID of the certificate hard-coded in here anyway, so it's much for muchness about whether we provide these values or not, but we'll use them just because I like to bring up the fact that you can do that. You can use the AWS class here with these methods on. Right, so we've created our certificate, we've created the domain name, and that's referencing the existing resource. And so this is the part where we have to translate between the construct here, which is a level 2 construct, and the resource in CDK. And then we need to compare the resource in CDK and the properties it gets with the actual values of the resource in the console. So let's do an npm run synth. We'll pop it into template.yaml. Oh, and I think I need to import this, don't I? Yeah, I do. Let's go and have a look at our template YAML. We've got our API gateway domain name and then metadata, and that's it. The conditionals we don't care about because we didn't put them there. Same with parameters, same with rules. So this is the interesting bit. This is the bit that we need to be the same as what's in the console. And sometimes it's very difficult to compare this set of properties here with what you see in the web interface. So what I like to do is to query the resource or resources with the AWS CLI. So we're an API gateway here. So let's do AWS API gateway help. And we've got a ton of methods that we can call. Let's look for, there's one for REST APIs, lovely. How about domain names? Delete domain name, get domain name, get domain names, update domain name. Let's go for get domain name. That sounds about right. And let's put that into the command there with help still at the end. And you can see that we just have to provide the domain name with -- domain name. So let's do that. And this gives you the properties as seen by the AWS API, which is often very, very close to the CloudFormation resource. So this is really great because we can go property by property and make sure that we've specified everything. So domain name, yeah, we've got that and it matches. Certificate upload date, we can't really change or specify that. It's generated for us. Regional domain name, regional hosted zone ID. See, these ones again are provided by API Gateway, so we don't provide these, we don't control those, so we don't have to specify them in here. And then we have a regional certificate ARN, and we are providing that, which is great. We can actually see that the ID is the same here as the one that's in the API response. We've got an endpoint configuration, and it is a regional type, which again matches. The status here is another field that we don't control, we don't specify, and that's coming back as available. And you can see we've got security policy, but actually security policy isn't present in our CloudFormation resource. So let's go and find the name of our construct. Let's pop to the old Google and we can search for that domain name construct. And let's see what properties we have. So we've got certificate, domain name, base path, endpoint type, mapping, MTLS, security policy. Aha, so security policy sounds like what we want. So let's pop that into our domain name here. And you can see that we've got one option for TLS 1.2, which is the same as what we've got in the API response here. So let's rerun our synth. And we can see in the template, we've got the domain name still, got endpoint configuration, regional cert, and then a security policy. And if we just pop that same response from the API back again, we can see that our security policy there is now matching. So it's really, really important that everything matches up identically when we're doing this. Everything must be the same between the resource as it's currently existing in AWS and the CloudFormation configuration that's going to get put in when we do this import. If the resource supports drift detection and you make a mistake, you can run drift detection, you can see the difference, and then you can manually fix it using CloudFormation, but it's really, really fiddly. And so I would try and encourage you to get everything matching up and try to avoid that process. Okay, so we've done that and we now need to call CDK import. So let's pop over to our package.json. Let's add in a script for import, pop it up with the rest of them. And we can do an npm run import. And we get guided through a really, really nice wizard to help us do this. And obviously the features in preview here you can see, but I've used it several times and it works really, really well. So that's asking us if we want to import that with the domain name of cdkcourse.jshares.com. You might get asked for the value, like an ID or an ARN you've got to import it with, but in this case it's worked it out for us, which is great. So we're going to hit enter, and you see there we've got an error, cannot modify or add role ARN. Now I don't think there's any role ARN specified in the template, so I think the most likely cause is to do with the actual setup of the stack. So let's clear out the main resource here that we're creating, the main construct, our domain name, and let's just run a deploy so we get everything in a consistent state before we start our importing. And with that done, let's uncomment the resource and let's try and import. We'll say yes again. Lovely, and so that has got our resource imported into CloudFormation. And you can see here at the bottom, it's talking about drift detection, and it suggests that you run this as part of the kind of cleanup process, if you like, once you've done your import. So let's pop over to the stacks view here. Let's go to our API stack. We can click on resources, and you can see that we have a CDK course. Let's go and have a look at the template, and you can see that we've got our CDK source here. Now, one thing that's really worth noting is that a deletion policy of retain has been added to the template here. So if I synth this locally, and we pop to the template, then you can see that there's no such property. So where did this come from? Well, this came from newer versions of the CDK CLI adding in that deletion policy, which is required by CloudFormation when you perform an import. If you're working with a version and it complains that you don't have a deletion policy set on your resource, we can pop the construct into a variable, and then we can do the variable, dot apply removal policy, and we can set the removal policy to something like retain. Then if I go and I run a synth again, just so we can have a look at that, you'll see that we now have deletion policy and update replace policy set. And we could just do another deployment if we wanted to after those have been put in there. Okay, so we've managed to successfully import our resource into CDK and CloudFormation. Just as a bit of a recap, so to start with, we identified the CloudFormation resources that would represent the thing that we want to import. So in this case, we had a domain name, and that was attached to a certificate and also had a DNS record. We looked at the CloudFormation documentation to understand what could and couldn't be imported. So in this case, we could import the domain name, but we can't import the Route 53 record set, nor can we import the certificate, the ACM certificate. And so we have to make a trade-off or weigh it up as to whether we want to import this into CDK, whether it's worth it, or whether we take the hit and have some kind of downtime or switchover. Once that was done, we looked at the CLI or API response to find the exact properties of our things, of our CloudFormation resources. We made sure that they were getting the same properties in our CDK, which is then flowing through into the template. And then we ran a CDK import operation. Bear in mind that for our imports with the version of CDK that I'm using here, a deletion policy was automatically added to the resource, and that may not be done depending on what version of CDK you're using, so you might have to apply a removal policy as follows.